You're listening to the Kansas State Department of Education's Insight Podcast, where we explore the people, policies, and progress shaping education in Kansas. School funding shapes what students experience every day, from class sizes and course offerings to the supports and opportunities available inside and outside the classroom. In this episode, we talk about how school funding works in Kansas, why it matters for families, and why understanding it is especially important right now.
Welcome, everyone. It's good to see you. Thanks for coming back to the KSDE Insight Podcast, where we get the opportunity to share with you things going on in schools across the state of Kansas and issues that pertain both to schools and to parents and students. Today, we're going to be talking about school funding, probably all the ins and outs of school funding and what goes into making up a good school budget and a state budget for schools, and then how that comes to play out for students and for staff and across the state. So we'll be asking questions from the classroom to the district level to the state level, and honored to have with me today Dr. Cory Gibson, the superintendent in DeSoto, Kansas, Dr. Frank Harwood, who's the deputy commissioner here at the state, and thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a great discussion about everything school finance, and we've just come off a school finance task force. So maybe we can kind of start with generally just talking about the task force that ended recently and what they looked at, and then we'll get in maybe the specifics of what makes up a good school finance law. But even before we get into those specifics, just why does even this topic resonate? With schools, I think we know the answer to that, but why would parents even be concerned about that and about all these nuances of school funding?
Yeah. Well, Dr. Watson, first off, it's an honor to be here, so thank you for the invite. You know, when I think about school finance and the impact for parents, it really comes down to in every single way, finance impacts a child's experience in school. And so, you know, the simplified version, of course, is the finance impacts the number of students sitting in the classroom. And in Kansas, we value smaller class sizes than some states. The opportunities provided to students, whether from early childhood to special education to bilingual to career focused, all of that is driven by the opportunity to have finances that supports those programs. So I know it sounds like a cliche or it's overemphasized, but truly it impacts every single kid every single day. And so what kids experience, what their parents want them to experience, is directly tied with those funds that are available for those resources. You know, when I think about times in our state's history when funding or finances were not adequate or equitable or not stable, not only did we increase class size, and not only did we decrease opportunities, we actually became less innovative, and we stopped improving the educational system itself. We became flat. And so having lived through both sides of that, we're in a better time frame now, but of course there's some things on the horizon we need to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Frank, as you think about then from the state perspective, you know, why does the formula matter for, you know, to parents from the state perspective? Where does it come from? Are the local people paying for this? Is the federal government paying for this? Is the state government? Let's just go to the 30,000-foot view first for everyone.
So the answer to that is yes. So their funding comes from a variety of different situations. I think though, when you look at like the state purpose for public education goes back even farther than that, and in you know, not trying to be again cliche, but in a representative republic, having an informed and educated electorate is the bedrock of that, and it has been since. And now that we're in the 250th year of our country, that's been a bedrock all along. So I think that, I mean, all Kansans should understand that the purpose of public education is to move the state forward. For parents, it gets a little bit more personal because now it's not, what are we doing to move all students forward? What are we doing to move my student forward? And I think parents need to have that perspective on things. And so parents typically aren't as concerned about how much funding the whole district gets or the whole state gets. It's how are those funds being used to to help my student be successful because I want them to be able to live a productive life outside of my basement and those kinds of things. So, I think that's why parents are going to be concerned about education. And then when they start looking at how it's paid for, they need to be paying attention to that because they're taxpayers as well. And so currently about 65% of the funding for districts comes from the state level, and about 8% comes from the federal level, which leaves about 37% to come from, or 27% to come from the local level. Now, Kansas is a little bit different because we have that 20 mills that is really a local levy because state school boards have to do that, but it comes to the state, so it gets counted as a state resource. So when you look at that, between state and local, it's about 92%, and then federally, it's about 8%. And that again makes sense because when you look at who's responsible for education, it is a state responsibility. It's in the state constitution that we will have public education to further the needs of the state.
So when all of our parents get their tax statements, they're going to see really clearly, here's the 20 mills or the exemption first, and here's the 20 mills that the state will collect and then redistribute around the state. But they're also going to see some local mill levy, and that's really what that mill levy is, what you're talking about, right, Frank? That's the local and the state contributions that are coming to DeSoto or to Meridazine or to Sabetha, Kansas, wherever those people live.
Well, I would say that that's the property tax portion of it. State taxes, typically they talk about a three-legged stool, or property taxes is one thing, but then it's also subsidized by income tax and sales tax for the state general fund. Locally, it's all property tax. The only thing that a school board can levy is a property tax, which includes the 20 mills. That's only about a little under $900 million of the $3 billion that the state spends on public education. So income tax and sales tax are also important in there.
And it's important to note. So before we get into really how the formula works and small school, large school, urban, rural, the two things I hear primarily as I go across Kansas, for either school people talk about it, community people really talk about it. I want low class size. I want really a personalized education. I want my school to be open. I don't want them to close. We've got some declining enrollment. So can you just talk in generalities? Cory, you mentioned a little bit on the class size about how the school finance formula interplays with those two things that at least I hear from a parental or community concern. And then we'll get into, probably it's going to raise the question of more details. But you spoke to class size. You want to go into that a little bit more? Because I'm sure in a growing school district like DeSoto, one of the concerns people have is, are our class sizes getting too large, and at what point do we have to do something about that?
Right. So the base funding, of course, is the funding mechanism that we look at for operational purposes, and that is driven by enrollment. So as enrollment drops in a district, so therefore the number of students and therefore the funding for the general fund may also decrease. And so what we hear often, particularly in a district that is growing, and I've been on both sides of that coin in my history, when a district is growing, families are very concerned about that. They know when they see a housing addition going into the district that, hey, that means more kids, and what is that going to do? Are we adding staff? And so I think that's why the stability of a funding formula that we can plan for helps so much. And it doesn't only just help us on the side of growing, it helps when declining. When we can see and forecast out that next year this is what the equation looks like and this is what the funding mechanism looks like, it helps us prepare. In fact, our board next Monday will decide the staffing for next school year. So almost 6 months in advance, because we go through a process that involves stakeholders, site councils, building leadership teams. They prioritize their building's needs. They bring it to the district level. We then look at everything on the list collectively with a whole group of about 45 people, and we prioritize that entire list. Right now it's 50 requests, which we know we cannot fund. And then from there, we begin sharing it with the Board of Education so that we can then begin advertising and placing where will that teacher go. And so I know our community expects that, and I know most communities in Kansas expect the class size. What I don't think every community understands is the complexity of that. And that is there are limitations, right? Even with federal funds, state funds, and local funds, in most cases, we're capped. We're going to get whatever is provided to us through those bodies. And so what also is a challenge for us is funding the class size is one thing, but that comes from the same pot of money to fund additional salaries and funding raises. And so that's always the balancing act of, if you're going to add staff, we also have to know that we need to support the staff we have. And that is probably true everywhere, but I'm going to tell you, from moving from other parts of the state in Johnson County, it is really true. You know, when I look out my office window, especially this time of year when the trees don't have leaves, I literally can see Panasonic. And what they can pay people and what they are paying on average is greater than we can pay for most of our staff. And so it's that balance. And I know that our parents recognize that. I don't know that I've heard many parents say, hey, staff don't need more money. Our parents don't need more funding. Our teachers don't need. That is not the norm. They too want to support their teachers and their staff as well in their local districts. So it's that balancing act and having enough people at the table to make that decision informed.
In an area like Johnson County and DeSoto, as you said, it's people, unlike in some parts of our state where you might be primarily in a certain geographic area, people just, they live somewhere and they work somewhere else and they shop somewhere else and they travel so much. So the competition for talent is both in the public and private sector there. On the other side, class size and keeping schools open, Frank.
Right. So
I know you deal with a lot of phone calls. Are we going to be able to have school next year? Our community really wants to have a school. Don't you think we ought to have it? Why is the formula not giving us enough money? Can you just talk to communities that have those concerns?
So it actually is kind of the opposite side of what Dr. Gibson talked about when you're a growing school district and you're talking about what you can add. If you're declining in enrollment, because, and we'll talk more about this later, because the funding formula is based on a number of students, when you have fewer students, you get less funding. The problem that a lot of the declining enrollment districts has is that if I lose 10 students, I've probably lost one from each grade. And that doesn't mean I can reduce a third grade class. And so now I'm in this situation where my class sizes got smaller, but I don't have funding to fund that because when the class got smaller, I got less funding. And so a lot of smaller districts, just one of the things is that, okay, well, we can't eliminate third grade. How can we put PE and music together? So then what it does is it erodes the additional opportunities. So can we have this extracurricular activity? Can we have this other class? Can we have dedicated people for specials and those kinds of things? Those are the difficult questions that districts are making, and what some of them are finding is that if we have to limit some of those opportunities, that can accelerate the declining enrollment because families have come to expect a certain level of service, and districts are trying to provide that. And then it's a little bit of the same thing that Dr. Gibson talked about with we have the list and we prioritize. You're doing the same thing. It's prioritizing, but sometimes it's prioritizing what we're going to keep. And it's a hard thing for a district that is probably the largest employer in the community when you start thinking about how you're managing that. And so again, the same thing comes up is the more predictable that is year over year, the better I can do at making plans for the future. If I do see declining enrollment, I have to start making predictions about is that going to be a long-term trend? Is that a short-term trend? And then from there, I have to make staffing decisions because I think the thing that I think is really important for parents to understand is that when a school district is budgeting, you're starting 6 months away with what staff you're having, and then you're starting negotiations. And so now you're figuring out how much you're going to pay that staff after you already figured out how many you're going to have. And then you find out how much you're going to have next year. School districts don't find out their final budget until the 12th month of the budget year. So it's not until June of the year that they're closing out that they finally find out what all of their funding was for that year, which brings up another question that comes up a lot is with cash balances, those kinds of things, and that districts have to have that to be able to plan and adjust because there are so many uncontrollable things in their budget.
You know, I was just thinking as both of you were talking, I really wish this was a live session where people could call in, because I do think the questions, right?
Right.
That people will have, they'll want to go a little bit deeper on, well, tell me more about cash balances. And we're going to have a limited time to try to describe, a fairly complex formula that's complex for really good reasons.
It is.
Because we're talking about, everywhere I go in Kansas, and I'll be traveling this week. We're filming this in early January. You'll be hearing this in January, and I'll be in Western Kansas. And people will say, "Can you tell me the difference between Western Kansas and Eastern, or Southeast Kansas, Northwest Kansas?" And I say, we really should be talking about rural Kansas, suburban Kansas, and urban Kansas, because those are really if you're in a rural part of Western Kansas, a rural part of Southeast Kansas, they operate very similar, have very similar needs, just like a suburban like DeSoto and Andover, very similar type of needs. And our urban centers like KCK or Topeka are very similar in how they operate. So I know that we'll have a lot of questions, and maybe, next month when we have a different topic, we'll have some questions that we'll try to answer around this. But before we get into the formula itself, and this will probably lend itself, the state of Kansas has had a formula for 10 years, or will be 10 years in 2027, from 2017 to 2027, and it is provide tremendous stability. The legislature knows this is what we're going to pay based upon enrollment. School districts know, at least as far as I can look at my enrollment, I know what I'm going to get. And I know both of you know that wasn't always the case in Kansas. So, but that law sunsets in 2027, and the legislature did we need to have a legislative study of this, and they've been doing that, and both of you serve on that. Can you just talk about that work that's transpired so far and what's taken place so that people know, and maybe we'll do a little forecast of what might be taking place in the future.
So first I'll say that the task force is kind of at a break, but it's still active in that the task force has to make a report in January of 2027. And so you are correct. The current formula expires on June 30th of 2027. So without legislative action, there is no formula July 1 of 2027, which means there is no way for KSDE to distribute funds to districts. So, something has to happen. It is as simple as they could just eliminate the date and keep doing things the same way. Because in 2017, when they made the current formula, it is very similar to the formula that actually got written in 1992. There have been tweaks to it all the way along. And the key to that formula is a combination of adequacy and equity, and that's where we've been with the Supreme Court. Before that, it was much more local. And when you get before 1972, it was all local. And what the state of Kansas figured out is that we have districts, we have area communities that can provide more with their tax base than others can. And is that fair? And the answer that they came up with is no. And so through changes in the Constitution and changes in state law, we have tried to equalize funding. And so that's making it so that regardless of where you live in the state, you should have similar or equalized or equitable funding. Not the same. There are differences, and we can talk about that. But that's kind of the basis. So far what we've done, and Dr. Gibson can fill in the parts I missed, we've really looked at the funding formula that we have and looked at what other states do. And other states are all very different. And we've had some conversations about, I think that mostly they like a student-based formula versus there are other ways to do that. But there hasn't been a lot of looking at, well, this is what we think the next formula would look like. So.
Yeah, I agree. I enjoy learning about other states' formulas. It's brought some insight to me, but I think the interesting part is I sat there, and this is the first time I've sat in a different position at the table in the legislature. What I think it's brought to light is the complexity is there for a reason. I do believe there were some, not only on the committee, but just statewide, that were saying, can we just make this easier for people to understand? What I think we've recognized is there's a reason why the weightings exist like they do and why they developed over the decades that they've been there. And it's in order to serve the student population best. And I think that is probably the biggest realization. And, we've dug very deep into where it came to be, how it came to be, what year the bilingual weighting may have modified or changed. And I think the complexity is what's probably slowed the process down a bit. And I think everyone at the table recognizes this is not something you just change overnight. Because when you just tweak one little thing, it's going to impact this district quite differently than it's going to impact another. And what I imagine will happen is we'll begin the process again, maybe in the month of January, to really start identifying what is it we want to change. Because we can't throw the whole thing out. There's just no way to do that. I mentioned a little bit ago that we're already deciding the staffing level for 26, 27, but we're deciding what options and opportunities for post-secondary in our district through 2030. And that's why the formula and the process has to really either have some type of phase-in approach, in my opinion, or we have to know it almost now in order to adapt and begin planning. Our boards are excited, our community is excited for certain things. Those won't happen if the formula goes through a radical change.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've tried to explain to people sometimes is that a funding formula can either be simple or fair. It can't be both. And so a simple formula is a student-based formula. It's just like, here's for every student that comes, this is what you have. That's really simple, easy to explain. But it doesn't catch all the nuances of student needs and then district needs, because a district that has 75 students and 1,000 square miles is different than a district that has 40,000 students and 75 square miles. And then just the needs of the students. So, and so what Dr. Gibson talked about is what I think many of the, especially legislators on the task force have found, is that I thought we could just come in and do this and that, and then I found out that, well, when you move this lever, you get this other unintended outcome. And so it will take some time to go through and really look at, all right, what do we prioritize? Because unless they really get to unlimited funding, then if you make a change, it either costs more or less, which shows up in each district differently.
Yeah, and unlimited funding, of course, no one gets unlimited funding. We have to be responsible to taxpayers, and we know the legislature wants that too, and they want quality schools. So it's always balancing those interests. So I want to now dive into the formula a little bit, and Frank, you really teed that up really nicely about simple isn't necessarily fair. So let's start. The median size school district in Kansas is just a little bit over 500 students. Now, Cory would say, well, that's a school, but that is the median size school district, and we range from Wichita, which is just under 50,000 students, to I believe our smallest this year is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 students. Thank you. That if the formula is simple, we just fund on so much per pupil. Every community is going to say that's not unfair for different reasons. So let's start with the smallest of schools. What does the formula do? And now we're going to start talking for parents to understand the complexity now starts to layer in, because now we're going to start to make this a little bit more fair with the differences we see across Kansas. So if I'm in a really small school district, and small is always whoever's closest to you, how do we ensure that classroom where they may only have 18 students total in third grade, how do we make sure they get a good education compared to a school district that has a lot more students? So
in the formula, there's a weighting called a low enrollment weighting. And so what that does is it looks at, if you have a really small school, you don't get economies of scale. And so it is more expensive because you still have to have, maybe it's a first and second grade teacher or a primary teacher, and you do combination classes and all those kinds of things, but you just can't make up for the cost through volume. And so school districts that have less than 100 students are in the smallest category and get a little bit more than a 1.0 weighting, which means every student gets counted as 2 when it comes to funding. Once you get above 100, that slides down, and so you get a little bit less for each student in addition to the 1 until you get to about 1,600. And then because the median was about 500. The average, the mean, is about 1,600. And so when it got started, when you were less than the mean, you got a low enrollment weighting. And so that makes up for that it's just more expensive per student in a really small setting.
And so that makes small schools happier because there is a part of the formula that tries to equalize that funding, knowing that there's some costs that they just can't cut in order to have that. But if I'm in Dodge City, I'm rural, but I'm in Dodge City, I've got some other issues I want the formula to address, I think, don't I? If I'm in Topeka, I've got some other issues I want the formula to address. So talk about what those are.
So Dodge City's where I grew up, so I know a little bit about Dodge City. So Dodge City, for example, ESOL, those students learn the English language. Students learn the English language.
Yeah.
And their percent of students, the population, last I looked, is somewhere around 43% of their students get support for learning the English language. And DeSoto, we're almost the exact same size enrollment-wise, is 3%. So there are weightings, whether it be at risk, whether it be career tech, whether it be bilingual, to help offset those additional needs and costs, and they deserve it and need it. And so, although in DeSoto our ELL population is served with about $300,000, Dodge City receives millions in the current formula, and they should, because that's the only way you can equalize the opportunities for students is through a formula that has some type of weighting. So it's one of those things that, once again, on paper makes no sense. Like, well, why is DeSoto receiving less in this fund? Well, it's based on the population and the needs of that population.
And oftentimes, for our listeners, I'm just thinking whatever school district pops in my head really at the time. So I mentioned Dodge City, and I think oftentimes if I say that, people think, well, this is about Hispanic populations. No. And I'll just use, whether it's Dodge City or Kansas City, Kansas, you're talking about hundreds of different languages that are spoken. It's not just Spanish that we're talking about, of kids that are here, and we're trying to transition them. And so Cory mentioned some other weightings, Frank. Let's just talk about some other weightings about where do we try, and I'm going to use the word equalize. We're trying to make sure that wherever you live in the state of Kansas, and the Supreme Court's been pretty adamant about this, you should be assured that the formula is going to give you a good base to have that good education.
So another weighting that isn't tied to like a student need is career and technical education, or CTE. That is a weighting for when districts provide skills-based, work-based learning opportunities for students. And it's because the legislature has tried to incentivize districts to provide education to help with post-secondary workforce. And so in doing that, it is a way to provide funding in a situation for what typically are much more expensive classrooms to have. They typically have to have pretty small enrollment and also expensive equipment.
And so that's very unique. We were talking about low enrollment and bilingual enrollment, ESOL, but this doesn't matter where I'm at. If I have a student enrolled in a certain program, so I can be in DeSoto, I can be in Concordia, I can be in Eureka, and I decide we're going to offer a welding program, and if that's one of the programs that the state says that's a CTE funded pathway, then that school can get money in order to put that program in, which again tries to equalize out those opportunities for high school students.
And it also then allows the community to decide what are the workforce needs of their community and what should we do. Again, the smaller district may not be able to offer as many different opportunities, but they can say, we really need ag, or we really need welding, or we really need healthcare, and then they can specialize in that area.
Okay, so if we talked about early on that the state funds some, the federal funds some, the local fund a portion of this formula. So if I'm in a very poor school district compared to very wealthy, why doesn't the wealthy just raise as much money locally as they want to and because the poor district's going to have a hard time doing that because of the tax burden that's going to put. Talk about what the formula does related to that.
Yeah, so equalization is a part of our formula, and the Supreme Court has ruled on that many times, that equal tax and equal opportunities for kids. And I think this is what sets Kansas apart in many ways. When you look at other states, there are states who do not do as well a job, and we could even do a little bit better, but they don't do quite as well as we do when it comes to equalization. So in other words, you could drive from one community to another, and the property tax rates can be substantially different. Although there are differences in the state of Kansas, they're not broad as they once were. The second part of that is, for an example, another district that's almost identical to us is Mays. Our assessed valuation, property through an equation, per student is nearly double that of Mays. When you look at the funding, it's almost equal. So what happens is, as your property or wealth per student increases, the amount the state contributes to certain funds decreases. And the opposite is true as well. So once again, it goes back to that belief in the state of Kansas that we're here for every student, regardless of district size, demographic, or what the wealth is in the community. And that much makes the difference, and that's what makes us unique. And my hope is that all formulas moving forward has that in play.
Yeah, it does. Frank, do you want to add anything to that?
I think the other side of it, because you asked the question about why doesn't the big district just raise as much as they can?
Right.
Actually, state law does not allow that.
Wealthier districts.
Wealthier districts.
May not be big.
Yeah, but state law does not allow for that. The amount of money a district has access to is determined by the formula. So you have the general fund, which comes just from the count and the weighting, and then you have a supplemental general fund, which people talk about as LOB, which is limited to 33% of that amount. And then what Cory was talking about is that based on your average valuation per pupil, how much the state pays towards your LOB varies from 0 to nearly 100% based on valuation.
Okay, and so again, I think for our listeners, they're already saying this is getting complicated. And it is, and we're just scratching the surface of part of the complication of this, because again, drive across Kansas and you'll see what makes our state very unique is that we're small population, large geographic, and the geographic regions vary tremendously in terms of density of school districts, density of square miles, and how many people are in it. So let's kind of shift gears a little bit, and I think we'll pull out part of the formula as we go through this. So then how does, Cory, you talked about this, you're already setting the budget, you're already thinking about staffing. What are some of the other considerations that go into planning for the budget, and how are you out? 6 months, 12 months, 18 months? What does that strategic planning look like in a school district?
Right. I would say multi-year, in fact. I think if you're going to be fiscally responsible, you're always thinking, what's the impact of this decision, not only for next school year, but financially, how does that play out 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road? And so I think that's great financial planning. We have great financial planners throughout the state that are doing that each and every day. Many of our boards are comprised of people who are anxious and excited for programs, but also recognize the business portion of schools and realize that every decision has a financial impact. So we're making those decisions. Enrollment's the big one, and that's the hardest thing right now in the state of Kansas. It's hard even for a district that's flat to slightly increasing, because if you look around those districts that you assume are growing, they're not right now. And it all has to do with birth rates from 5 years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago. They're filtering into our kindergartens. They happen to be smaller than they once were. And so enrollment is one of those factors we look at most, and it's just a best guess. And some of us actually pay to have support, and even as a best guess for them as well, as to how many students you expect 2 years down the road, 5 years, or 10 years. The other factor, of course, you can look at is what is it your community expects? Working in the district office of Pittsburgh, going to Halstead, then to Valley Center, and now to DeSoto, every community has had a different perspective with input of what they hope their kids can get. The foundation's the same, right? Reading, right? That's all the same. What we start getting to is some nuances, or what are the needs, right? So Pittsburgh, 70% free and reduced. The needs look different, and what the community expects, and what we were expected to do to help support students' foundations with small class size, summer school, all those opportunities looks different than where I am now. And so I think, once again, that's the nuances of all of this, is every district's board is looking at and getting a community pulse about what it is that their community expects and wants. And from that, decisions are made that do, of course, impact the financial aspect.
And Frank, as you do budget workshops every year and you're talking to board clerks and superintendents, how are you kind of just talking about the budgeting process? What should they look at to do the budgeting process? What's the length of time? How do you give advice to school districts and to operate in that realm?
So one of the things that I think is staffing is actually drives most of the budget. I mean, about typically between 80 and 85% of a school district's general fund budget is going to be on staff. Because the most important thing a district can do is have great people working with their students. That's where you make a difference. Education is a very people-centered endeavor. And so it's not about, all the things you can buy. Those are important. I mean, the instructional resources, all those things are important. But when it comes back down to it, can you pay the people that you need to have doing the work? I mean, a lot of people say, you don't go into education to get rich, which is probably true, but you also don't do it for free. And so making sure that you look at those things all the way through. And so that is starting to you have to start making planning about what's going to happen with health insurance and what's going to happen with property and casualty insurance. And what are you doing with making sure that what's utilities? All those things are important, but mostly it's going to be making a decision around how many people you are hiring and how much you're paying them. Because as Cory mentioned before, you can pay more people less or fewer people more. At the end of the day, the budget is set because of the formula, and then some other things you do, and then you have to prioritize around that. And looking at, it's hard to go in and say you should budget this way, because I don't know the context of your district. I can tell you the things not to do, but how you prioritize it, that's there. But you got to start with staffing, and then you have to make sure that we have adequate building space. We can transport students, we can feed kids, all these kinds of things go into that. But that's to start around staffing.
So I want to now take it to a few specific areas of the funding formula, and maybe again how patrons feel. Obviously, school districts have to think about this. As we think about transparency in a very complicated formula, there's a lot of different moving parts to it. So let's just talk about carryover of money from one year to the other? And why shouldn't we just spend every dollar and then get more money the next year based upon the student count? Why would any school district carry over money? What's the purpose of that? Because I know if people are coming to the budget hearings, they're going to want to know, why don't you spend that down? You may want to talk about those that would wish they could spend it down. But talk about that a little bit, Cory. What's the purpose of cash balances in a school district?
So it's no different than the personal side, right? You hope you have a savings account because you don't know what tomorrow brings, right? And obviously, if you're a good business person, you likely have some type of balance off to the side in case something unexpected happens. And so school districts are no different. Part of it is just the way of which we receive the funds and the time frames we receive them. So part of it is just the nature of, hey, we have to know right now in the state of Kansas, we're not going to receive any funding for special ed until October, but we're responsible July, August, September leading up to that. And so, of course, you have to have some type of balance to pay the staff that are on there and support the programs. So part of it's necessity out of that time frame. The other is the unknowns, right? As mentioned, Dr. Harwood a little bit ago, we're going to make decisions before we even know the exact dollar amount we're receiving this year that's going to impact next year's budget, and we don't know how many kids are going to be there. And so one of the things that we look at, of course, is that we're going to decide how much we're going to pay, how many staff we're going to have, programs are being in place, but yet we don't know the funding side. So even in the district in which I currently serve, enrollment has been a little tricky for us. And we had a couple down years in my first years there. Had we not had balances, I'm not quite sure how we would have navigated the unknowns. We had already committed to the staff. We've already paid what we said we're going to pay, but we didn't get the money we were anticipating because the growth was not there. And so part of it is just the nature of that. And the other thing is that if you really look at the funds we can tap into, because sometimes we're talking about all funds. We have bond and issue. We can't use that for staff salaries. So bond and issue is paid the mortgage, right? It's paying off bonds. And so those exist for a specific purpose. Federal funds have a specific purpose. And you go on through the list, and what's available to you probably is relatively small, no matter the size of the district or where you're at. If you look at, like, for example, in our district, and we carry over okay, right? We're okay. We're not high, we're not low, but we're right in the middle on cash balance per kid. And then you look at, by the time we get to October, we're in single digits. And we've had times in the state where the state could fund us at the right time, and we need to have those funds in place in order to make sure we can continue to meet our obligation should there be a delay for a month or whatever the case may be.
You bring that up, and my heart goes sunk because I remember cutting budgets twice in one year, and that's not a fun proposition when you're trying to figure out what to do in the middle of a year because state had run out of money and we were in a recession, and it was really tough. Frank, so how do you again guide school districts? If you think about personal, I think everyone would know if you study personal finance, people say, it's really hard if you're living paycheck to paycheck, and I think all of us around the table have done that, live paycheck to paycheck. It's a little nicer if you can say, boy, if I could just have 1 month of expense, boy, if I can get, my financial planner said I should have 6 to 12. And I remember those early days, like I'd like to have a day, but so what is appropriate for cash balances, in general? How do we advise school districts about cash balances?
So one of the issues that comes up with that is timing. So we calculate cash balances as of June 30th because that's the end of the fiscal year. And so when we look at that, we advise districts that in your operating funds, which are the ones you have the most the most flexibility with how you spend them a lot of on salary, those kinds of things. We say 15 to 20%. We have districts that are below 10%. And they are just like a family that, they're a breakdown away from having a problem. We have districts that have too much. There are other balances. The reason we talk about operating funds, Cory brought up bond and interest. For bond and interest, you have to have more than 100% of cash carryover because you only get tax payments in January and June, and you make your payment in September or October. So you have to have all of the funds plus any reserves you want to have left over. So it varies by fund. Capital outlay is another one where districts tend to have higher cash balances. And we've been advising districts to make sure you have a healthy cash balance there because of what's happened with insurance. I mean, many of our districts are now, their deductibles are 1% of the value of each building per incident. And we have buildings out there that are $150 million. And so 1% of that is a lot of money. And if you don't have that money in capital outlay so that you can make up for the tornado, the storm that came through, you're out of school for a long period of time. And so looking at 15-ish% on operating funds and then looking at the special funds on what those purposes are for. And in some cases, as of June 30th, it needs to be more than 100%.
And a lot of things have gone up in cost. Inflation has increased a lot of things. But insurance has really been something that over the years, whether it's health insurance, property casualty insurance, other insurance. And I know we've had school districts that were not properly insured to rebuild that facility. And unfortunately, things have happened to them and they're not properly insured. I remember a time on the health insurance side when in the pool I was in McPherson, we were talking about, wow, what are we going to have? We got a surplus, and now deductibles have gone up. It's hard to keep that. Cory, talk about how you juggle that side of it. Right. When those costs you don't even know sometimes year to year what's going to happen.
Yeah, a lot of my colleagues would say there's three things that could break a district in Kansas right now: property insurance, health insurance, and then special education costs that are increasing on the district side. And so it truly is one of the most difficult. Each year, in fact, just over the last couple of weeks, I began doing the best I can to predict, based on the data that's in front of me, what next year's budget may look like, because we can't make the staffing decisions. We certainly can't negotiate until we have an idea. And there's no way you don't put away substantial amounts of money on the side in your mind for those things. Last year alone, because of the cycle of how insurance fell, ours begins in January, which is the middle of the contract year, and that's not abnormal, the middle of the fiscal year. And our rates, if we were going to pick up what we've always picked up, we're going to cost the district $1 million.
So I want everyone here, if you don't change anything,
just do what we've been doing.
$1 million
over a 12-month period.
And you would have known that in the middle of a year where you've already budgeted.
Yep, already made. So there's no reasons why you need cash balances. We had predicted $400,000, so you can see the variance there. Property casualty, almost identical. Now, we did have significant events the year prior, so we can anticipate it. We had hail damage on several buildings. We had a tornado on a school ground, which caused damage. Once again, you can't predict those things, and as a result, you can expect, though, that your insurance is going to go up. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you're right, the deductible also went up. So the next time that happens, we need to have more money in the bag. In fact, if it's in the district in which I currently serve, if we had a tragic event, which is unlikely because the space is a building, our deductible now for a tragic event across multiple buildings is $4 million that we need to have in the bank in order just to hit the deductible. It wasn't that long ago that $50,000 would cover it all as a deductible. So districts are faced with very similar things that we're all seeing in inflation. It's no different than many of us are experiencing in our personal lives, that things just cost more, and we may not be getting the same amount or value that we once did for those things.
And yet, Frank, if again, school districts, let's still use both sides of it. If they underinsure a building, or if they can't provide health insurance, tell about what happens then to school districts if they can't provide those type of things.
So on the property insurance, I mean, if a tornado comes through or a fire or those kinds of things and the building is unusable, that's a multi-year situation. And what's going to happen is that if you're underinsured, the bond issue required to replace the building is going to be a lot more expensive.
I think people need to know, again, whether you're in schools, running schools, or you're taxpayers, you're the Kansas Legislature, because we're all want to be very prudent to the tax dollar,
right.
Is that cost is dramatically more expensive. I've been looking at the cost. I know you've got bond issues coming up here soon, where the cost of new construction is really going up. It's really high.
About 33%. I mean, it's well above the average inflation. And so, so on that side is that you are then faced with where do we have school? Because if your building is not safe, you've got to do something else. And smaller communities, it would be a mess. On the health insurance side, the problem you have now is that we already have some districts already have a difficult time attracting teachers. If you aren't offering quality benefits, and most employees are good at looking at, well, here's the salary, but here's the benefits, and then what does that cost me on this other part? And so you are no longer competitive. And so now you aren't able to attract the best people and retain them.
Things have changed so much. I was teaching in Andover, Kansas when our daughter was born. $10. That was my total expense to have a child. I had a $10. That's what I paid. Those days are gone. Those days are just gone. We have limited time, and we've only really scratched the surface of school finance. I know that a lot of our listeners will have lots of questions. I want to end one topic, and then we'll see what is on your mind. Let's talk about special education, because that is an area that also is increasing faster than inflation. The cost of special education kids, and I want everyone to understand how schools have to approach that, laws around that, and then funding formula. So Cory or Frank, I don't know who wants to start with that. Can we just talk about special education?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge for no matter the size of district where you're at in the state of Kansas. We're all seeing increases in the need and the severity of the need. And once again, when we talk about special education and the challenges, we're not pinpointing the kids. We want to serve the kids, and we need to serve the kids. They need every dollar we're giving them and more, to be quite honest. So it's not a let's place the blame, but it is a complicated issue. There's lots of federal regulations, there's lots of state regulations, and there's expectations when a parent sits across from the school and says, this is what my kid needs based on disability, and they're right. The challenge, and we're in a unique situation, and this isn't just for us, but it's across the state. We're in a unique situation where the funding for special education at the state and federal level is not meeting the growing needs that we're seeing in our districts. In fact, it's predicted that this year, for the first time in our district's history, over 50% of the special ed funding will come from local sources. And what I often explain to people is once the IEP team makes the right decision, we do not have a choice but to fund it. So what happens is, for all intents and purposes, it's a demand transfer. It comes right off the top. So here's the cost, here's what we know the state's going to send to us, here's what we believe the feds are going to send to us, and the difference is made up by the districts, whether it be through local option budget, property taxes, and or general fund. What remains is what we fund for the rest of education. And so when people say, well, I don't have a student that has an IEP, I don't know why I worry about the special ed. It's because your student's fund, general fund, the base funding, is being helped or moved to subsidize special education. In fact, the base aid for funding, state aid per pupil funding last year was around $5,300. In the district in which I serve, $1,100 from every student came out of that base to help support special education that's not being funded or being neglected at the state and federal level. So it truly is one of those areas, and we're talking millions of dollars. We spend $9 million a year in our district alone for special education support.
So it's a special education need. It's also a regular education need as the transfer that you must make. I was just thinking that literally 30 years ago, 25 years ago, just as an example, in McPherson, Kansas, where I was at, we had 2 primarily identified autistic kids. Mm-hmm. That's not true today. Now, we can argue why is autism on the rise, but it is. And that would be from mildly, on the spectrum from mildly autistic to severe. And so some of the severe needs that we see in schools are increasing cost. So Frank, talk about, Cory mentioned the federal and the state. So talk a little bit about, for people, where's the funding for special education come from, and a little bit what the federal side is and the state side is, and why, as Cory said, maybe that has to be looked at in whatever new funding formula is going to happen.
So this will get into why some people find school finance so complicated, because the numbers are really big. And so in 2025, local districts spent about $440 million of local dollars on special education. The state law says that the state will fund 92% of excess costs. They would have needed to spend another $225 million. So half of that amount should have been not a local but a state fund. So so any of those, that $220 million that should have what was spent on special education should have been available for general education or other purposes. On the federal side, in 1972, when the federal government passed IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, that requires special education, they said, we'd like to fund 40% of this. They're currently at about 12%. If they were funding all 40%, that would be about $220 million. And so the state legislators are not wrong when they say that if the federal government was doing what they said they were doing, they wouldn't have to do more. It would be about right. But the federal government said, we'd like to do this. State legislation says, this is what it should be, subject to appropriation, and they just haven't appropriated the funding. But at the end of the day, as Dr. Gibson talked about, is that once it gets in the IEP, there's no choice. And so that $225 million comes out of what would have otherwise been spent on general education.
Yeah, and so we all would say, wow, we wish the federal government would pay if I'm at the state, and but the district's saying, we have obligations to meet a law that's both state and federal, and we have increasing costs and increasing demands. And Cory, as you mentioned, parents are rightfully saying it's going to take this to educate my child, and the IP team agrees. And so I think as we go forward, special education will be one of the topics that's heavily discussed in school districts, in your local communities, and at the Kansas Legislature, and maybe even at the federal level, because at some point, we're going to have to make decisions, about what to do as we near that 2027 deadline. We just have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask a question. But if there are things that we missed that are really important, I want to bring that out also. I'm a parent. I'm a community member. I want to understand more about the formula. I want to understand more. I want to make sure not only my taxpayers are being used, but they're being used well for my community demands. How do parents become engaged? What do they need to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one is, I don't know a person that works in a district that isn't willing to sit down and talk to someone about this. I mean, obviously there's over 130 reports that we submit to the state and or feds a year. So there's a lot of data out there, right? And if you go to any board agenda, you can find exactly where the dollar for dollar where money is being spent, but it is complicated, right? And so I think one of the things that people can do is obviously pay attention first, go to board meetings, watch board meetings. Second, if they want to get engaged, and that's the more important part to me, like I want to be part of this. I want to be part of the solution. I want to understand it. I say that one of the easiest ways to get engaged is a site council. Every building has a site council, and increasingly over the years, their responsibilities are to look at data and determine what the needs of that building are, and then submit. So when I talk about the staffing requests that we receive and we're now prioritizing, it came from the buildings, right? Site council said, yeah, that makes sense. We need another third grade teacher. Or, hey, we would really like to add whatever, orchestra, name it. And so getting involved and engaged helps see the lenses. All districts, of course, publish their budget documents on their website. Some go above and beyond and provide additional details. One of the things I've found to be most useful in my time is each year as we're preparing the budget, I just do a quick video voiceover. It may not be the quality of this podcast, but it's a voiceover of just explaining to people what's increasing in our cost, how does the budget look different, and how does our revenue look different. I think that goes above and beyond, but it also provides a real quick way, 15 minutes for people to sit down and watch and go, I see why we're doing what we're doing. So lots of opportunities. One of the simplest people, one of the things that we do often in schools is we want feedback. We use surveys today because everyone's busy. Feedback from a survey can determine exactly where priorities are. A recent survey for us is what determined that we're heading to a bond. Our community said, yes, we want these things, we need them, let's go to a bond. And so that's how those decisions are made. So even those smaller things that only take 10 to 15 minutes can have a dramatic impact on where the districts spend their money.
Frank, how would you encourage patrons to be engaged? This can be very complicated, and as we, I hope, conveyed, it's complicated because Kansas is very different from east to west, north to south. But how can parents engage to know that my kid's getting a quality education for an amount of money that we're being taxed on?
So I think the first part is making sure that they're talking to their student about the education that they're getting to determine if what they're getting is what they think they should be. And if not, they need to be talking to their local school about, here are the needs that I think they're going. And if they think they are, they also need to talk to the school about, you're doing a great job, because I think folks need to hear that as well. Some of it is, I don't think it's a lack of information that districts or the state provides about the budget or funding. It probably might be that there's too much information because it has to be. School finance is complex, because if it's not, then it's not fair. And so because of that, I think the idea of, I try to do it over my time, doing, small meetings with site councils, and, I'd go talk to anybody about, budget and spending that they wanted to, and nobody shows up. Every district has a bond hearing and typically a revenue neutral hearing every year. In 7 years in the last district I was in, we had one person show up for one bond hearing or budget hearing. And so we get these questions and people complain about things. I think they just need to ask. And if districts or if the state get enough people asking, we'll set up opportunities for education. And we could do some more things with explainers, and we could look at even what Dr. Gibson talked about. We could put together a video about one of the budgets and say, if you're looking at the budget, this is what you ought to be looking at. But I think it's the question of engage with, this is what I think our community needs, or this is what my student needs. How can we help that happen? And you'll find out either that maybe everybody else doesn't have the priority you have, which is again a community decision, or it's, that's a good idea. Maybe we should be looking at that. And or at the end you'll leave knowing, okay, they're making good decisions. Maybe not the decision I would make, but they're making good decisions. But you can't do that without engaging at a level other than complaining.
Small thing about what you both are talking about. I received an email literally in the last couple of days from a very engaged patron. Said, I really think in Kansas high schools, every student ought to have access to a specific course. And if not, at the bare minimum, they should have access to it as an elective course. And the patron said, I don't find it being offered in hardly any high schools. And I said, well, during the early 2000s, we had a task force on high school graduation requirements. And that topic, I said, it never came up one time. We had students, we had parents. It was not a priority at that time. It's a priority for you. And so I said, here's what you can do. You can either start to talk to other people that maybe have the same priority that would come to the state level, or you can go to your local, start there and say, is there enough interest in doing that? Because to do that, financially is then a trade-off for something else, and then you've got staffing. Not that it can't be done, but again, you're going to have to weigh that with other priorities and interests going forward. Dr. Cory Gibson, Superintendent de Soto, Dr. Frank Harwood, Deputy Commissioner, we hope that you have enjoyed this conversation around school finance. As we've said, it's not simple, it can be complex. We hope that we've left you with some ideas. We encourage you to go have a conversation with your school board, your school superintendent. Cory mentioned be on the site council, be involved, understand it, spend the time. You don't have to understand all the details but understand, is the money being spent to the best use of how I feel my child should be educated. And we're just grateful that you tune in every month to listen to KSDE Insight. Please like, this podcast. Tell other people about it. We produce this on YouTube and on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, and we hope that you take the time every month to listen to the podcasts that we produce. Until next time, thanks.